And former President Donald Trump is now formally appealing the decision made by Maine's Secretary of State to remove him from the primary ballot there. In Maine, election challenges are first ruled upon by the state's top election official. Last week, Secretary Shenna Bellows ruled Trump was ineligible to appear on the state's primary ballot based on the 14th Amendment, the same statute that Colorado's Supreme Court used. Now that her decision has been appealed, it will be heard by the state's Superior Court. A new filing from the Trump legal team accuses Bellows of prejudice in her decision. Quote, the secretary was a biased decision maker who should have recused herself and otherwise failed to provide lawful due process. The Secretary of State responded in a statement writing, I have confidence in my decision and in the rule of law. Everyone who serves in government has a duty and obligation to uphold the Constitution first above all. The court has until Sunday to decide whether to overturn Bellows' ruling. That decision can be appealed all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. We do have timing issues with that as well. We're going to speak with Secretary of State Bellows when she joins us later today on Morning Joe. But what's so interesting, Willie, is, again, this is the question about January 6th. Was it violent? Was it an insurrection? Of course, it was an insurrection. We can go through all the details as to what was happening there, who was injured, who died, what weapons were used, who was in jail for now years of their lives for participating in it. And all the 14th Amendment is looking at is whether or not Trump engaged in insurrection. They're not asking if he started it, if he ended it, if he was planning it. Just was he a part of it? That's a pretty simple question. And that then brings us to eligibility. Like, people who are under a certain age are not eligible to be on a ballot. It's a simple question, whether or not he is eligible. It's not a political question.
Well, and the argument from Trump's camp and from his supporters and some constitutional lawyers is, well, he hasn't been convicted of insurrection, to which the Maine Secretary of State and others have said, well, we've seen plenty of evidence from the January 6th committee. We've seen evidence in all these cases. We've seen media reporting that he did, in fact, engage in it. And the Secretary of State in Maine made that decision for her state. We'll talk to her coming up in a couple of hours. Charlie Sykes, you've got a new piece. Is disqualifying Trump anti-democratic? And by that you mean, is a lone Secretary of State stepping forward and saying this candidate cannot be on the ballot, is that anti-democratic? Where do you land on that question?
Well, first of all, I mean, I'm very, very sympathetic to the argument that the 14th Amendment disqualifies Donald Trump. I'm skeptical about how it's going to play out politically. I think there is a potential for a backlash. But the bumper sticker punditry here is that we are defending democracy by undermining democracy by taking Donald Trump off the ballot. And so I tried to address a very, very narrow question, which is that we talk a lot about democracy, and justifiably so, but I also think we need to be precise that this country is not actually a democracy. It is a liberal, constitutional, representative democracy. And all of those terms mean something. Democracy is just not about elections. It's also about the rule of law. And the Constitution means something. And so there are a lot of things that the majority does not get to do in the United States. The Constitution lists many things that even a supermajority can't do. It can't repeal the Bill of Rights. It can't do things that, in fact, are prohibited by the Constitution. You cannot be, if you're 32 years old and you're a citizen of Norway, you cannot run for president. That is just unconstitutional. And so those things are undemocratic, but they are not necessarily anti-democratic. They don't undermine democracy. The liberal constitutionalism of our system says that we are a nation of laws, not of men. And I think that, in some ways, the Trump folks are about to do this flip, where they are saying, the people who claim to be defending democracy are undermining democracy. This is a plausible argument, which is why we need to push back and say, okay, we are a democracy, but it's more, we are something else as well. And our founders understood that deeply. They were very, very skeptical, and they created all of the separations of power and the checks and balances to basically say, yes, we are a democracy, but we are also a nation of laws. And I think that's a point that we need to make, because, look, we're about to see Donald Trump wrap himself in the cloak of a defender of democracy. Don't be surprised when he manages that particular flip.
And that's why time is of the essence here for the Supreme Court to make some kind of decision. Will he be on the ballot or will he not? Let's bring in former U.S. Attorney and MSNBC contributor Chuck Rosenberg and State Attorney for Palm Beach County, Florida, Dave Ehrenberg. Guys, good morning to you both. Chuck, I'll start with you. So Donald Trump's lawyers have asked the Superior Court in Maine to vacate this decision by the Secretary of State there, saying, again, it's undemocratic, that she doesn't have standing to do this on her own. How do you see this playing out with, of course, the United States Supreme Court and its decision looming as well?
Yeah, if you just want to focus on Maine, Willie, under Maine law, the Superior Court has to move quickly and to hear the case. But of course, if the United States Supreme Court comes along and stays all of the various state proceedings, and you still have unresolved state proceedings in almost 20 different states, then Maine will put its litigation on hold. And I hope and I expect that we're going to get a single ruling from the United States Supreme Court. So right now we're talking about Colorado and Maine and what Michigan and Minnesota have done, and they've done different things. But if the United States Supreme Court steps in, as I think they ought to, you're going to have, I hope, one ruling that sets the standard across the country. I mean, the danger here, whether you loathe Mr. Trump or love Mr. Trump, is that you have or might have proceedings in 50 states with different rulings from each. And that's really untenable. So I expect Maine will move quickly until and unless the Supreme Court tells them to stop, because the Supreme Court intends to take the case and to issue a single ruling.
So, Dave Ehrenberg, whether it's a Superior Court or Supreme Court, Charlie Seitz was talking about backlash, and, you know, there could be a backlash, and that's something that might need to be considered, some might say. Is a Supreme Court justice or a Superior Court judge looking at backlash, or are they supposed to? What's the job? I mean, I bring it down to, if you discipline a child for getting into a fight, do you go, maybe I won't discipline the child because other kids might get mad? I mean, is the job to worry about backlash, or is the job to decide whether or not President Donald Trump, former President Trump, engaged in insurrection and therefore is not qualified to be on the ballot?
Good morning, Mika. It's not supposed to be considered the political backlash. I mean, that's why you give federal judges and justices lifetime appointments. They're not supposed to put their finger up to the wind, see which way it's going. Now, state judges may get elected, but they too are not supposed to take into account the political consequences or the polls. And I know that some are saying, as you discussed, that this is undemocratic to take the matter away from voters. But as Charlie said, this Constitution of ours has to mean something, right? I mean, I think it's undemocratic to allow people to run for office who aren't qualified to do so. If Barack Obama announced he was running for president this year, Republicans would light their hair on fire, right? And they'd have a point. The 22nd Amendment to the Constitution says you have a maximum of 2 terms. He does not qualify to run, even though the voters may want him. And Trump, ironically, built his political brand on saying that Obama didn't qualify to run because he wasn't a natural-born citizen. Of course, he was. But you can't say that the natural-born citizen clause applies, but the insurrectionist clause does not. They are all qualifications to run for president, and you can't ignore one of them because you're worried about angering MAGA voters. Mika, the alligator is always hungry, and you're never going to satisfy these folks, so stop trying to appease them.